Okay, I think it's time to get into the main meat of today, which is we might be facing EU-Russian war at some point in the near future, which is not great. Let's start with this.
Probably for the first time since the Russian independence of 1991, the Russians fought with the NATO forces, and that was officially recorded by the Romanian authorities. So
Yes, so now NATO and Russia have fought. Officially, it's happened.
today we had several
get into
reports, and these things are very interesting. So let's discuss everything in details, and let's think what is going to happen next. And when talking about this battle between the NATO aviation and the Russian drones, so first of all, I would like to remind you that today the Russians attacked the territory Ukraine using hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. And this picture was published today by different sources, and there are lots of lines. There are
See these drones disappearing here? Well, they were shot down by UK jets.
Red lines, yellow lines, or
flying, I think, out of an airbase in Romania.
Orange line spots when talking about the battle between NATO and the Russian forces. Of course, the most important and interesting lines are these ones between the Zaporozhye and Crimea, the southern Kherson and Crimea, and the territory of Odessa. So as I see as of the 25th of April of 2026, some sources reported about the situation, but it seems that sources underestimated the situation with this episode on the border between Romania and Ukraine. So once again, to understand what happened, we need to once again to discuss and to remember how exactly this massive attack
This is important, so we should go over everything like it's going to do.
Was developing. And as we discussed it during the previous video, first the Russians were conducting a reconnaissance operation over the territory of Ukraine, and as we discussed during the previous videos, there were lots of pictures.
These are like snapshots, like radar takes a snapshot in time, and all these dots are something it detects in the air, and that's why there's all these different ones. It's snapshot here, snapshot there. And as time passes, the dots move because drones are flying.
Lots of different updates about the situation between 9 p.m. and 12 a.m. between the 24th and the 25th of April of 2026 over the territory of Ukraine. So nothing special, just hundreds of drones that were like zombies flying over the territory of Ukraine, seeking and searching for their target. But at some point of these nights, more precisely on around 1 a.m. Between the 25th and the 26th of April of 2026, we received a very interesting update that the Russians suddenly and most likely unexpectedly launched a big batch of drones. So a big wave of drones was launched by the Russians from the area of Crimea and from the area of the southern Kherson in the direction of Odessa region. We're talking about this wave of attack, about this batch of drones. And when talking about this picture, of course, we can't calculate the exact number of drones that the Russians launched in this direction, but the sources during the nights, the monitoring sources who was following the situation reported that there were dozens of drones. So up to 40 drones of the armed force of the Russian Federation were launched in the direction of Odessa. And of course, from the first seconds, we could say that the Russians most likely were planning to attack the Odessa infrastructure. And of course, different monitoring sources began following this group of drones. This is the update, let's say somewhere around 1 a.m. This is the same situation. The drones were approaching and were
each one of these is a different snapshot in time.
Approaching and we're moving in the direction.
I think it looks like 30 drones to me.
Of the Odessa region, and at some point somewhere around at 2 a.m. We were able to understand that most likely the Russians weren't planning to attack the port infrastructure of the city of Odessa, and just according to this picture, most likely we can understand and we can make a conclusion that the Russians were planning to move further. The Russians most likely were planning at this point, at this time, at this moment, to attack the cities along the border between Romania and Ukraine, and we are talking about the settlements of Reni and Ismail. And the next photos that were published from this area confirm this information. The Russians were moving further, and for example, from this angle, from this perspective, we see that the Russians somewhere at 2 a.m. approached these two cities, approached the border between Romania and Ukraine, and we see that not 2, not 3, not 4, not even 10 drones managed to do this, but according to different sources, according to monitoring channels, up to several dozens of drones of the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to approach these two cities, the city of Ismail.
My guess is around 30. Or between 30 and 40.
And the city of Reni, just with one purpose, to destroy everything that was located there. But the next picture tell us, and the next picture shows us that at some moment, somewhere at 2:20 at 2 a.m. and 20 minutes, the drones, these drones have disappeared. They disappeared. So there were dozens of drones, up to
So if they disappear, it either means that they found their target, dived down towards it, and exploded, or they were shot down.
40 drones, and just 20 minutes later, 20 minutes after, we can see probably 5 drones that were flying over the Odessa region, and during the next 5 minutes these drones disappeared as well. So when we were discussing this situation during the previous update, I came to the conclusion that probably either the Russians destroyed something, or the drones reached the city of Reni or the city of Ismail, and they began bombing and attacking different objects of the port infrastructure and the logistical infrastructure of Ukraine in this area. So, and this is the reason why we had 40 drones, and then 5 minutes later we had just 5 drones. So that was the only explanation for me during the previous update and several hours ago. But and of course I continued working, I continued updating the Mac, maybe making videos, many other different things. But I noted that during the
There was no, in all the other cases of all Russian drones attacking different places, next day there's videos from citizens with their phones taking videos of smoke coming out from somewhere because something was hit. And
day, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received
but that didn't happen here.
almost anything from the Odessa region. And for example, in comparison, when talking about the Kiev region during the day and right after the Russians attacked the city of Bela Tserkva, we received this video where we can see a very big black smoke over the settlement, which confirms that the Russians attacked an object of energy infrastructure in this area, and there were no doubts that the Russians were attacking this territory with missiles and drones. And the same situation concerns the city.
Because normally the drones hit either, an object of energy infrastructure, a power station, ammunitions. They say the explosion causes something else to explode, and there's smoke afterwards in most of the cases of these drone strikes on Ukraine.
Of Dnipro in the Dnipropetrovsk region. As for this territory, as you can see, we received hundreds of videos from this area, lots of videos, lots of from different angles, from different parts of the city, and
Exactly.
all these videos
40 drones. You'd think there'd be some videos like this.
confirm just one thing, that the Russians indeed attacked the city of Dnipro significantly using hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. And when all these updates were published during the day, I was always asking myself a question: what is happening with the Odessa region? Why during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything? Why the Russians used probably several dozens of drones to attack this region, but we
30 to 40 drones and no pictures of damage afterwards.
haven't received anything? And somewhere at 5 or even 6 p.m. of the local time, we received the answer to this question. And first, this is the first report that
UK jets authorized to down Russian drones.
was published by the Romanian authorities. British fighter jets have been authorized to shoot down Russian drones over Ukraine.
Another huge escalation on top of all the other escalatory steps that have happened in the last few months. And this one might be the biggest of them all in terms of escalation.
In territory near the border with Romania. According to Romanian Minister of Defense, a Eurofighter Typhoon detected a target 1.5 kilometers from the Ukrainian city of Reni in the Odessa region and received permission to destroy it. So this debris from one of the drones was found in Romania in the area near the border city of Galati. So this is the settlement of Galati, and some debris were found in the area of this settlement. So this is the first update that was published on this matter. And later we received another report. British fighter jets were given permission for the first time to shoot down Russian drones over Ukrainian territory near the border with Romania. The Romanian defense minister says, according to the Romanian defense minister, a Eurofighter Typhoon fighter jet made radar contact with a target at a distance of 1.5 kilometers from the Ukrainian city of Reni in the Odessa region and received permission to destroy it. According to information we have as of the evening,
So you have NATO fighter jets destroying Russian drones over Ukraine. So and those Russian drones are operated by, they're part of the Russian military. So the Russian military being fired on by NATO aircraft in Ukraine.
of the 25th
It's basically an act of war.
of April of 2026, the Minister of Defense of the United Kingdom denied every single statement that was made by the Minister of Defense of Romania.
So what's happening here is Romania definitely knew what's going on. It's there. It knows how these drones were shot down, and he knows it was shot down by UK aircraft, and it does not want Russia ticked off at Romania. It wants it. it's basically an act of war to fire. If let's put it this way, if Russia flew into Iran and started shooting down our drones there, we'd consider that an act of war. United States, if there were Russian fighter jets over Iran shooting down our drones, definitely an act of war, and that's what the UK has done here.
The United Kingdom is saying that they has nothing common with this situation. They are not connected with this situation along the border. And you know that there is another important thing and another important detail in this report is that the Minister of Defense of Romania, neither the Minister of Defense of Romania nor the Minister of Defense or any other authorities of the United Kingdom confirm or provide us the numbers. So according to this just a regular statement, a British fighter fighter jets, they don't clarify the exact number of jets that were given this permission, received permission.
It must have been more than one, because shoot down that many drones, you need more than one. Yeah, you'd need a lot of fighter jets to take down 30 to 40 drones.
To shoot down Russian drones. So they don't give numbers, and this is the most important information. So when summarizing everything, when summarizing these reports that were published by different monitoring channels, when talking about the Minister of Romania report, we see that most likely it was a real battle. It wasn't a battle where the Russians had possibilities to attack the NATO Eurofighters, Typhoon aircrafts, because those were drones that were tasked to attack in front.
I'd say if they wanted to get all the drones, they'd have 10 fighters, 4 missiles each, 4 targets each, and 10 UK fighters taking out 40 Russian drones. That's not a small engagement.
Infrastructure that was like some surface-to-surface drones, not like surface-to-air drones. And the NATO countries used for the first time since the beginning of the conflict on Ukraine, probably since the beginning of independence of Russia, officially their forces to attack and to destroy drones over the territory of Ukraine. And the most important thing, that these drones weren't moving in the direction of the state of Romania.
Yeah, they were over Ukraine. They weren't attacking Romania.
Yeah, they were destroyed above the territory of Ukraine, in the airspace of Ukraine. So, which means that for the first time since the beginning of the special military operations, since the beginning of the 1991, without any permission, without any fifth article of the NATO organization, without anything, NATO forces raised their aircrafts. They reached the border between Ukraine and Romania, and somewhere from these positions, these aircrafts destroyed drones of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in the number of approximately 50 units that were flying somewhere here, and they destroyed them. So they protected, they defended Ukraine.
Okay, now this is why it's a big deal. Just the fact that NATO shot and destroyed Russian military equipment, Russian forces, is a huge deal. But if Russia doesn't respond, you know, if it just lets it slide, what's going to happen is you're going to have NATO states. It'll happen again. Yeah, you're going to have you're going to start having fighter jets, more and more EU fighter jets flying over Ukraine to shoot down all those drones that we saw in that Russia shoots from its territory. Because if Russia doesn't respond to this, that's the pattern. Escalation every time. Ukraine is losing the war badly, faster and faster. It's reaching the phase of military collapse, where expect Russia to take more than twice as much land as they took last year, maybe 3 times as much. It's going to get to a point where soon Odessa is going to be in trouble, as there's a tide that sweeps over. And part of the panic on the EU side that the proxy war is going badly for them is all this escalation. The other things they've done is Denmark, Norway have intercepted Russian tanker ships, like try to impose an embargo on Russia. And so recently, Russia has escorted one of its tankers past the UK, a military escort, a destroyer accompanying a tanker, because of the threats. UK has said it would basically seize any Russian Shadow Fleet tanker that passes its waters. I mean, huge escalation. Other thing that happened is now all the drones being fired from Ukraine into Russia, deep into Russia, damaging oil infrastructure, factories, energy plants. They're being manufactured in the EU, in like Italy, in Germany. And so you have drones being built in EU, then fired deep into Russia to destroy stuff. And it's basically, just think of it. EU is firing drones deep into Russia and destroying critical infrastructure. They're just doing it from the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine has practically nothing to do with it. It's U.S. intelligence that provides the targets. The EU builds them, and Ukraine is just a launching point. And on top of that, the other escalation is they've started firing those same drones built in Europe. Now they've started firing them, or either like this, traveling through the Baltic State airspace to attack Russia, or more likely from the Baltic states themselves, and then attacking ports and critical oil infrastructure up here. NATO weapons fired from NATO territories, going through NATO airspace, going into Russia, and then bombing critical oil infrastructure with practically no Ukrainian involvement whatsoever. It's an act of war. It's absolutely an act of war. And now we have this latest escalation of UK fighters flying into Ukraine and destroying Russian drones. So Russia, you talk about deterrence. It needs to do something about that, and it will. That's the problem. What is it going to do?
Of an American delegation, the Americans decided that there was no point in them going either. Well,
let me just find. Here we go.
and in the meantime, the Europeans are happy to sacrifice Ukraine as part of that war, which they are currently prosecuting against the Russians. As Larry
It's
Johnson,
basically the EU attacking Russia at this point. And there's people actually in Europe that are talking about, we need to prop up Ukraine so we have time to arm ourselves so we can fight the Russians. It's just a one-track mind. We need to just fight the Russians, no matter what. Ukraine's practically irrelevant at this point. It's just, it's insanity.
that most insightful of commentators, has correctly pointed out on his blog, Sonar 21, the Russian Foreign Ministry is now increasingly turning from talking about diplomacy.
Title this, Lavrov warns Europe declared war on Russia. So there's those in Russia that view Russia and the EU in an actual state of war already. And we have UK fighter jets shooting down Russian drones. No Ukrainian involvement.
To talking about Russia's need to mobilize, to prepare itself for a future conflict, if not with the entire West, at least with Europe. And, well, the Russian Foreign Ministry has now published further...
By the way, if it's just Russia against Europe and not US isn't in the picture, Europe gets crushed, absolutely demolished. It's not even close. So, with the United States distracted in Iran and having spent so much of its ammunition, I don't know if they even would come to EU's rescue if these provocations do end up with Russia-EU war.
Comments. They've talked about certain comments made by the French ambassador to Russia, Nicolas de Rivière. Nicolas de Rivière has talked about how proposals made by the coalition of the willing might be the basis of his future settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. The Russian Foreign Ministry has responded by saying that de Rivière's ideas are nonsensical. This is how TASS, the official Russian news agency, discusses the Russian Foreign Ministry's words. They say that de Rivière's comments are detached from reality. They provide a highly distorted view of the Ukrainian crisis. His ideas about the possibility of resolving the Ukrainian conflict based on the French-initiated coalition of the willing proposals are designed purely to uphold the interests of the bankrupt Kiev regime and its sponsors from the Europe's War Party.
Yeah, it is.
The proposals are highly fanciful. Neither France nor other EU countries.
And also, the chances of Ukraine joining the EU now are zero. Why? Because the EU is becoming a military. They're trying to militarize itself. It's trying to become like NATO without the United States. That's what the EU is trying to become. And Russia's not going to let this EU that is highly antagonistic towards Russia. Having Ukraine join that is just as bad as Ukraine joining NATO. There'll still be missiles in Ukrainian territory pointing at Russia if it allows this to happen. And so, yeah, Ukraine isn't joining NATO, period. It won't happen because Russia is not willing to accept that, and it's not going to end the war until there's a regime in Kiev that declares, yeah, we're never joining NATO. And Zelensky will be long gone by that point.
Countries are currently participants in any negotiation process. All actions by Paris and other Europeans are aimed at derailing any positive process on the progress on the European crisis. On the part of France, we do not see constructive proposals aimed at finding mutually acceptable solutions, but rather attempts to launch parallel initiatives, the result of which could be imposed on Russia in a definitive manner. Such an undiplomatic approach, completely detached from the actual situation on the ground, is doomed to failure from the start. And Nicolas de Rivière knows firsthand about France's participation in the Normandy process, the role of the previous French president, Francois Hollande, which merely served as a smokescreen for allowing the Kiev regime more time, and portraying Ukraine as some sort of victim for aggression is simply an attempt to absolve responsibility for the collapse of the Minsk agreements and to justify France's destructive role in the acute conflict that has erupted in Ukraine. So we see the rhetoric from the Russians about the Europeans get harsher and harsher, and this
is just the latest example. It's been happening. A lot of hardliners are coming up into power in Russia, both from the military and domestically through like success in their economy and joining the government. And the old guard is getting replaced, and the new guard is much more hardline towards Europe. So if you were someone who fought in Ukraine, yeah, you don't have a positive view towards Europe.
Cannot be detached from the recent statements by Medvedev, by Lavrov himself, by Shoigu, the warnings to the Baltic states about their allowing their airspace to be used for attacks on Russian territory.
Yeah, it's normally a port up all the way up here. There should be no way for Ukraine way down here to fire up a missile through all this Russian airspace and then hit this port. But what they're doing is just firing drones from here, poof, into and a very short distance in Russia, and hard to defend against attack right here.
The warnings about the discrimination against Russian speakers in the Baltic states.
Oh yeah, that's another huge thing. Ethnic Russians in Estonia are second-class citizens who can't vote, for example. Isn't that cool? You think EU has some? It's supposed to be democracies, right? Well, no, they allow some members to not be democratic, as long as it's ethnic Russians are getting fucked over. No, it's a joke. Yeah. I would feel absolutely no sympathy for Estonia if Russian goes in and, this just becomes part of Russia. Don't mistreat your people. Don't have second-class citizens that can't vote.
And potentially, by the way, in other countries. The Russians have recently started talking about Moldova in this context as well. The warning from the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Mikhail Ulyanov, about the Baltic states being unwise to think that the Russians are scared of taking action against the Baltic states, if they must do. And, of course, the new law passed by the Duma, authorizing Putin to deploy the Russian military abroad in order to protect Russian speakers without first having to consult the Russian parliament.
And the fact that they passed this law, Russia passed this law that now the Russian military can take action to protect ethnic Russians without needing authorization from parliament, that's directly aimed at these Baltic states that have these second-class Russian citizens that can't vote and that are being oppressed. So it's already has legal framework in place, Russia, to mount an attack or an invasion of the Baltic states. They're busy in Ukraine, but Russia has a lot of forces in reserve. They could open a second front. I don't think they will. I think that until they're done with Ukraine.
So the rhetoric from Moscow is getting harsher and harsher.
But there might be missile strikes. And like, for example, they published a list of factories where the drones being shot into Russia are being made across Europe. One thing they could do is just bomb those factories. If they, at some point, if the EU keeps escalating, if now instead of just this one time, now you have every time Russia fires a drone, you have EU fighter jets flying in and destroying them, and maybe more escalation on top of that. At some point, Russia just say, "Well, we're basically at war with Europe. I mean, fuck, it doesn't matter anymore. There's no reason not to," and they'll just bomb the factories where all Ukraine's drones are getting made, like Germany, Italy, France. They have your Oreshnik missile. They can reach all of Europe, and they can target any factory they want and destroy it.
And here we have Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, somebody who's recently been in Beijing having discussions and consultations with the Chinese leadership. Here we see Lavrov.
And the fact that, yes, now we're having high-ranking Russian officials having discussions with China. That, to me, strikes like they're talking about all the provocations that EU is doing towards Russia and what Russia is doing in response. And just to give China a heads up that we're going to be expanding the war in Europe is what I think is happening, or that they might expand the war in Europe. It's not a dangerous sign, in my opinion.
Lavrov coming forward and saying that Russia and Europe are now, in effect, in a state of war with each other. That the
Yes.
Europeans have effectively already declared war on Russia. And I spoke about.
Yeah, so high-ranking official Lavrov, sorry, what is his exact title? Lavrov, Russia. Minister of Foreign Affairs. When you have the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying outright that the EU has already declared war on Europe, don't be surprised if there starts being a war in Europe in the near future, given all I've pointed out so far. All the provocations, all the steps Russia's done to prepare for war against Europe and make it so they can they've already set up legal framework for going into the Baltic states. They've been warning, saying these are red lines, like you can't make drones and then shoot them deep into our country and we won't strike back. So odds are there's going to be the war in Europe is going to expand. I don't know when, but it's going to expand because it's been a series of provocations. First, they started going after ships. Then they started making the drones in Europe to shoot them into Russia. Then the Baltic states started using their airspace to allow drones to be shot. Then you have UK jets flying into Ukraine and shooting down Russian drones. It's one escalation after another escalation after another escalation. And why you're guaranteed practically to have a bigger war between the EU and Russia is because even if Russia doesn't respond to all the provocations so far, the EU isn't going to stop. There'll be new provocations, more provocations. If Russia doesn't strike back against the EU for this latest thing, for example, well, that'll just embolden the suicidal idiots in Europe, and they'll do it more and do more aggressive, shoot more drones up here from the Baltic states into Russia. And at some point, Russia will have to respond. It will. You already have Foreign Minister of Russia saying that EU and Russia are at war. So maybe no one's talking about it yet, but war between EU and Russia, that is very, very strong possibility in the very near term. And let's watch a video on that, more on that.
All right, Alexander, the 90 billion loan to Ukraine. It's a great loan. It's a great loan, Alexander. You don't have to pay it back, and there's no interest for Ukraine. Anyway, that's been approved. Europe celebrated. The Europeans celebrated along with the special guest of honor, Zelensky, here in Cyprus, in Ayia Napa, Alexander. And my sources tell me that they really did celebrate. They really did celebrate the 90 billion gift to Zelensky. The 20th sanctions package has also been passed.
Yes.
Kaja Kallas is already talking about 21
The
sanctions.
EU is making a 90 billion loan to Ukraine, well, only 30 billion is actually going to get to Ukraine, because the rest is going to like weapon manufacturers and industries in Europe to make weapons for Ukraine. In any case, none of this money will ever be paid back. Ukraine's not paying it back, and there's sort of this hope that they can force Russia to pay it back, which will never ever happen.
This package, and today they are going to be discussing getting Ukraine into the European Union, and they're also talking about the militarization of Europe so that they can go into a war with Russia. At least that's the obvious purpose of militarizing Europe. By the way, Alexander, Finland has removed, or the Finnish government has submitted a proposal to the parliament in order to remove legal barriers for hosting nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Yep, isn't that great? Let's look where Finland is. Right here. Finland. Right next to Russia. Yes, having nuclear weapons right on its borders. I'm sure Russia will be perfectly okay with that, right? You ever heard something called a Cuban Missile Crisis? We, the United States, went absolutely apeshit when Russia started putting nukes in Cuba, here. You know, nukes right here off the coast of the United States. And we went absolutely crazy, and we embargoed them. We did try to invade them, Bay of Pigs invasion. I mean, complete mess. But we, very clear, having nuclear nukes right on our border, not okay. That was the EU position. How do you think Russia is going to feel about having nukes right on its border? Think it'll allow that, or you think it might invade beforehand? If it has any words of nukes heading towards this place, it might launch an attack. I'm thinking it might launch an attack to prevent nukes from ever being deployed here. It would go just as nuclear as we did over Cuba.
That also happened, and we also have Poland.
That's what I mean. That's another provocation that's in the works, that they authorized this, and if they actually try to do anything about it, another escalation. EU is dead set on war with Russia.
France, they are engaging in military exercises, preparing to or game planning the nuclear bombing of Russia, of St. Petersburg. So they're having all these military exercises about flying over Russia and bombing St. Petersburg. And we have the UK.
Yeah, that's not provocative at all, is it?
Which is also...
I mean, you don't hear stories about Russia wargaming bombing Paris, do you? Do you hear that? Have you heard any stories about Russia wargaming bombing Paris?
Game planning some sort of an attack or invasion of Kaliningrad.
No.
All of this is going to happen over the next couple of weeks, all of these military exercises and operations. Lots going on with regards to Russia.
That's why I think EU-Russian war is nearly inevitable at this point, is that the train is on rails and heading that direction. If you think all the escalation so far towards China, Russia isn't enough, there's a whole boatload on the way. And Russia, for its part, is becoming more and more hardline, and it's seeing this, and its red lines are being crossed one after another. It has to respond. It'll nearly be forced to. A war between Russia and EU is nearly inevitable, I think, at this point.
Europe that is absolutely obsessed and focused on going to war with Russia, on escalating with Russia. And now we have the 90 billion to Ukraine.
Let's start with the 90 billion. Money handed over to Zelensky. Lots of unanswered questions about the 90 billion euro loan, by the way, because the original plan, as I very, very well remember from December, was that the European Commission would place bonds in the international financial markets, and that the loans would, the money for the loan would be raised via those bonds. And well, we always said there's a big question mark over this, because it's completely unclear when the bonds are going to be redeemed. Supposedly it's going to be when the Russians pay reparations, but when's that going to happen?
Never.
Ukraine is never going to pay the bonds. And that did beg the question of whether, in a situation like the one that existed in December, people in the financial markets would buy the bonds. Now, we are now in a completely different situation again. We're in April. We have a massive economic crisis staring at us over the horizon. Um, Budget and financial problems appear to be growing. I would have thought that the eagerness in the markets to buy these bonds, is going to be significantly less than it was in December. In fact, I'd be very surprised that anybody would buy these bonds, which begs the question of whether we are in fact looking at the same loan today as the one that was being discussed in December, because they're now talking about distributing the money to Zelensky very fast. So what I think we're actually going to see is that they're going to take the money straight out of the European budget.
And he's going to mention it. This is like the first step to EU taxation. The EU wants to become like the United States, where the huge amount of power in the federal government and the states basically are have much less power. It's one country with a lot of small regions called states in it. That's what the EU wants. It wants to be one country, and all these states like France, Germany, they're just territories in the country called the EU, and it wants all the power. It wants to be able to tax and govern everything. It wants to be able to wage war with Russia when it wants. And democracy isn't a huge big. Brussels isn't democracy. No one understands how it is. The voting is so untransparent. It's basically a bureaucracy designed to undermine the will of people. Like the vast majority of people in Europe don't want this endless migration, yet they still get it. As an example, it's not. The EU is an institution designed to fuck over the European people.
And that governments are going to increase their contributions to the European budget over the next few months. That, in theory, should be authorized by European national parliaments, because it's a transfer to Brussels. I think in Germany, they'd be able to do that.
The EU exists to further the aims of the US deep state, in that trying to handle each individual country in Europe is a pain. Having this one institution that you have huge control and leverage over in Brussels, and then you can just set that, use that to attack Russia, and it's a means for the United States to more easily control European people. It's completely against European interests to do this war with Russia and via Ukraine, yet it was still done because Russia is a threat to the dollar hegemony of the world, and so, like an obedient puppet, the EU is obsessed with taking Russia down.
Some other countries, it would be very, very controversial. So I think one of two things is going to happen. Either the Germans will transfer most of the money, or it will be sent to the European Commission through various backdoor mechanisms, which are probably technically illegal. Just saying. There is another factor at play here as well on the 90 billion euro loan, which absolutely no one is talking about. But in February, the Russian Central Bank started a case in the European Court of Justice, saying that the decision that was also made in the autumn of last year to change the terms on which the central bank reserves were being frozen.
Basically, the EU has been doing tons of illegal stuff to try to fuck over Russia in every way they can. And one thing they did is, after freezing Russia's foreign reserves, which was an act of war in itself, an act that undermines the financial markets in Europe, because what central bank wants to have reserves in Europe if when they don't like you anymore, they can just freeze them and prevent you from using your money. But even if it undermines financial markets, they did it anyway. They froze Russian assets. And then the way it was supposed to do is every 6 months, member states vote whether to continue freezing those assets. But what they did is they did through, because at the time Hungary's leader Orban was not was sort of pro-Russia, or he was against the EU, and he would put a halt to some of the extreme stuff the EU tried to do. And to get around him, they basically said, okay, we're not voting anymore. The Russian assets are now frozen permanently, and we're not voting anymore. And they just basically by a bureaucratic act did that. It was illegal, even within the EU framework, but they did it anyway. And now the Russians have done a legal case against that act that was blatantly illegal by the EU, and it's going to create issues for the EU because Brussels is all about bureaucracy and rules and stuff, and violating their own rules this blatantly, it's going to be hard for them to pull off.
To change them from a situation where the freeze had to be rolled over every 6 months. There had to be a decision every 6 months to roll it over, to one where it was indefinite, that was illegal. And
It was.
again, I remember at the time that there was a lot of discussion in the media at the time, in Britain and elsewhere, that what the European Union was doing actually was illegal. So on the face of it, the Russians have a very good case, because it's all over the media, in which case, again, the prospects for any repayment of this loan out of the Russian central bank reserves evaporates if the case is won. So all sorts of questions about this loan. I've no doubt the Ukrainians will be paid over this money soon, but I suspect that when you look at all of the legal issues that are stacking up, the doubts in the financial markets, the question mark over this case in the European Court of Justice, all of these things, I suspect that what we're going to see is a direct transfer to Zelensky, not of 90 billion euros, but of 30 billion euros, and it's going to come straight out of national budgets, first and foremost, Germany's budget.
Yeah, 60 billion is going to go to weapons contracts.
Exactly. So this is going to just be another part of Merz's rearmament drive, a subsidy to his favored companies in Germany, to Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, companies of that kind. And Zelensky will actually get 30
Companies that are in trouble because of both cutting themselves off from cheap Russian energy and now the Iran war cutting them off from cheap Gulf energy.
30 billion. And as I said, I suspect it's just going to come out of Germany's budgets. That's the only way this thing
Germany
can
will
work.
have the majority, but the other EU member states are going to have to. They're going to have to figure out where to get this
Yeah.
money and then transfer it to
Yeah.
Brussels, where Brussels will then just hand it over
Yeah.
to Ukraine.
Yes,
I mean, this is the way I've understood it.
yeah, but
So I mean, the EU member states are on the hook. Like
They
Greece,
are.
even though the contribution is small, say the
Yes.
contribution from Greece is,
Yes.
I don't know, let's say 2 billion. I'm just throwing a number out there.
Yes.
They're going to have to find that 2 billion, and they're going to have to hand it over to Ursula.
Well, that's the theory. Except,
Yeah.
of course, as I said, to repeat again, getting a 2 billion euro contribution.
To Brussels, and then into the MIC, then into Ukraine, then back into Europe. I mean, that's the purpose of all of
but
this.
that's exactly the point I'm making. What we're going to see is a direct transfer, an off-the-books transfer, because it has to be done off the books in some way, by governments directly to Ursula, bypassing parliaments, which technically, I suspect, in many cases, is going to be illegal. But I can't see how it can be done in any other way.
They can't go to the markets. I mean, who's going to buy?
No.
No one's going to. No one's
No,
going to buy.
especially with this court case now underway.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I mean, nobody's talking. Notice though that
Well, they don't want to talk about it.
nobody. Well, exactly, but I mean, the media's not talking about
Exactly.
it. In social media, they're not
Exactly.
talking about it. Nobody,
Because we don't have a functioning media in the West.
nobody talks about this. And you know, this is not a purely technical point because
I mean, this is something, you're talking about a $90 billion loan that's going to come out of the pockets of the EU taxpayer. That is something that the EU media should be talking about. It's, think of all the good that the 90 billion could be done if it was spent on the European people.
if the European Union is now raising money, again, without reference to national governments, through member states, in other words, member states are collecting money for the European Union to fund a war in Ukraine, then we are a huge step closer to the EU setting up its own tax systems.
exactly.
That's what it wants to do. It wants to be like the United States government, you know, federal, it wants to be able to tax the income of every EU citizen directly, bypassing countries, taking the money directly. Taxation without representation. That's the EU's goal.
That's another benefit to all of this, isn't it?
Well, of course it is. Of course it is. But notice again the incredibly stealthy way in which it was done. And no,
Yes, because, and it can only be done this way, is the functioning media should be calling all of this out. But we don't have functioning media in the West.
wonder they're all partying. in
That's why they're all celebrating.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the real reason. I mean, it's
Has anyone ever given you a loan, Alexander? and they've given you a loan with no interest, no
Well,
need
no.
to pay it back, and they decide to fly you to Ayanapa and to celebrate with
I
you.
know.
I mean,
Exactly.
That's what happened. They flew all these EU leaders flew to Cyprus with Zelensky, and then they partied because they were giving him a 90 billion loan that he's never going to repay. Isn't that absolutely batshit insane?
of course they're happy.
Exactly.
Because
But as I said, I think
this is
people,
everyone's money.
yeah, I think people need to take a step back and think this through. Nobody's doing it. Nobody's saying it. Nobody's explaining how it's going to work. But it cannot work in the way that was discussed in December. This is a completely different loan, and to me, it looks like a straight transfer from European.
Okay, I imagine somewhere down the line something's going to have to get published,
Yeah, I mean,
some audit or some.
yes,
Or maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, you publish a 50-volume budgetary thing. Each volume is about 2,000 pages long.
Right.
And on page 147 of subparagraph 3A, whatever it is, you'll find.
EU is so undemocratic, the European Union, the way it operates. It exists. If there's no transparency, if people don't know what's going on, there's no accountability, there's no democracy.
Some little sentence, very ambiguously written. And, well, that will probably provide somebody who can understand the language in which it is written, I mean, the bureaucratic language in which it is written, what it means. But I doubt that many people will look. I mean, this is the world that we are now in Europe. And I think people need to understand that.
Some countries are going to go into debt, I imagine, to hand this money over to Ukraine, right?
Some countries are absolutely going to go into debt. And of course, it's not as if they aren't in debt already.
Right.
No.
Okay, let's talk about the militarization. What's going on here?
Well, again, a flight from reality. I mean, just as the loan is a kind of flight from reality, a flight from reality into direct taxation by Brussels. So everything else that you were talking about is a flight from reality.
The EU will collapse at some point with the dollar. The dollar's collapse will bring down the euro with it. And the euro is one of the things tying European countries together. Is they think the cost of trying to get out of the EU, they can't because the euro, they're still in the euro. No, it's one of the things that makes it difficult for countries to even consider leaving the EU. Britain was able to do it because they still had the pound. They weren't using the euro. They weren't dependent on Brussels via the euro. But the thing is, if the dollar collapses and the EU collapses, oh my God, people are going to be... The currency collapse tends to make people very angry. Yeah, when all your life savings go up in smoke, poof. Yeah, they tend to get pissed off over that. And that anger is being directed towards the EU. And with the euro's collapse, one of the biggest pillars holding countries hostage and being forced to stay in the EU is gone. The countries will want to have their own currency, and they'll need to leave the EU to have their own currency. Because the only way to make sure you don't experience hyperinflation again, is to have the currency under your government's control, not some way off bureaucracy that managed to fuck it up one time. They'll fuck it up again if you let them. So countries, the EU will completely collapse with the collapse of the EU, the euro. And the euro will go down with the dollar at the same time, because the collapse of the dollar will undermine faith in all currencies not backed by gold. And like Russia, China, Iran, countries with huge gold reserves backing their currencies will be, Switzerland, will be seen as more stable. And those nations, their currencies will survive. Those without huge gold reserves, just finished. And yeah, the euro will go down with the dollar.
Reality as well. The British talking about military operations against Kaliningrad. Britain has no army. Its spending has collapsed. It's was it the HMS Dragon, which was sent to the Middle East, broke down and had to be brought back. The aircraft carriers have no fighter jets.
Well, Britain and NATO. Let's be a little.
All right,
Britain and
NATO.
NATO.
But where in NATO? Where in NATO is it any better? You talked about the Finns lifting restrictions on nuclear weapons. And of course, we know whose nuclear weapons we're talking about. We're talking about America's ultimately. France obviously has some. But okay, the Finns are going to take that step. The Swedes probably will. Sweden currently is now looking at fuel rationing. I mean, they are. You would have thought that this is their priority now. But of course, it's not. They're going to Cyprus. They're partying there.
They're partying Cyprus about a loan to Ukraine at a time when the Middle East is blockaded and there's no oil coming out, and their economies are months away from total collapse. Their economies are a month away from total collapse. And they're not focusing on that. They're partying with Zelensky.
They're talking about militarization. They're talking about war with Russia. They're talking about hosting American nuclear weapons, even at a time when relations between the US and the Europeans are coming under stress. It is a complete flight from reality. There's no relevance to the actual real situation as it is playing out on the battlefields in Ukraine. And we talk about...
Yeah, I think there's still this assumption that if they can just provoke Russia into war with an EU state, a NATO member, that'll trigger Article 5 and the United States will be forced to come in. I think the ability of the United States to come in has been depleted hugely by this Iran war. I mean, you have the 3 aircraft carriers in this region, and it'd take like a month just to get them to Europe, for example, just as an example. No, and all our ammunition's depleted. No, we aren't ready for a confrontation with Russia, and we're not very happy with Trump is not very happy with Europe right now too. And if Europe decides to provoke Russia into war, I think the United States will not do much. I don't know if they might do something. I don't think Trump will want Americans dying. My bet. I think it's the Europeans that'll do most of the dying.
About Finland hosting the American bases and American nuclear weapons. But of course, we've just seen in the Middle East that US bases don't actually provide you with a great deal of protection. And American nuclear weapons in Finland...
Yeah, Europe, it might get the same treatment as all these Gulf states that had U.S. bases and thought, well, we're protected by the United States, and then the countries the bases get U.S. bases get leveled, and then all types of stuff in their country gets bombed. That might probably be the experience of Europe. U.S. bases. I mean, the United States. By the way, this escalation in Europe is 100% Trump's fault. I'm sorry, fuck Trump. He not only messed up in Iran, but what's going on? All this escalation EU is doing in Europe, Trump could put it to an end to it with one tweet saying, if the EU keeps on provoking Russia, the United States will not help them out when Russia strikes back. Saying just basically saying we won't honor Article 5 if you keep provoking Russia this way, or something of that effect. And then all this nonsense stops in Europe. If the U.S. clearly communicates they're not going to be involved if there's war between Russia and Europe, all the nonsense stops, because Europe has no chance whatsoever against Russia without the United States.
In the case of a war with Russia, remain under American control? And would the Americans really be willing to use those nuclear weapons in a conflict with Russia, which would end themselves? So the whole thing, as I said, is unbelievable, extraordinary belligerence and aggressiveness by a continent that is running on empty.
Just watch a video on the states of any of these European countries, like state of the UK Navy or something like that. It's pathetic. It's Russia would crush. In the past, it wouldn't be like this. Past, like 30 years ago, Europe still had militaries, but today, if you take Turkey out, just the rest of Europe versus Russia, rest of Europe gets crushed.
What's Russia's reaction to this? I get your point.
Yeah.
With let's talk about the nukes in Finland. I understand where you're coming from, and the U.S. would retain control of those nuclear weapons. But what if the United States decided to launch them from Finland? You're talking about maybe a 2 to 3 minute travel time before they hit Russia.
Yes,
maybe even less than that. I mean, you're right next door. I mean, I understand that this is a continent. Europe is a continent that is broken and busted and in complete mess.
Yes.
But still, if you're Russia, you have Finland saying we're going to host American or French nukes on our territory, and if you're Russia, you're just going to
and Norway and Sweden too.
And Norway,
I
and
mean,
Sweden.
they are all heading in that direction.
Right. Do you just stand back and
insane.
and say, okay, no problem, because you guys are bankrupt or in recession
Yeah.
or broke, or you're led by a bunch of incompetent
Yeah.
people, or because the US has the codes, it doesn't really bother us, or we're not too worried about it. No, you can't say that if you're Russia. You would have to take action, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, and,
Yeah.
and this comes back to a program I think we recently did, which is that over the last, well, since Valdai, I think Valdai was a really important event. There was the,
Valdai is when the United States and Ukraine tried to assassinate Putin. They tried to just assassinate it straight up with drones. During negotiations, again, just like they did it in Iran successfully, but when they tried to do it against Putin during negotiations, kill him, it didn't work. And Putin is not very happy about it.
the clear attempt to assassinate Putin. Putin himself has largely vanished from the scene. We see much more hardline figures, or rather much more hardline comments being made by other people. And there's clearly been a shift in mood. And the Russians have now passed a law saying that the Russian army can be deployed to protect Russian speakers wherever they are. And by the way, there are Russian speakers in Finland as well. And the Russian church has a presence in Finland. I visited the cathedral there many times, just to say. So, the Finland too, they are making very clear, giving very clear warnings now to the Baltic states. And I think there is something else, which is that over the last 4 years, especially over the last year, apparently there's a lot of people. There's always the Russian bureaucracy, like every bureaucracy, has churn. People retire, new people come in. The people who are coming in, a lot of them are people who played a role in the war, and apparently they're much more hardline than the people that they're replacing. And this is indeed causing a shift, just as within Russia there is now a shift with new industrial groups and new monopolies and people of that kind focused on the Russian domestic economy, no longer thinking quite in global terms or idea economics oriented towards the West. They are coming up through the economic world as well. And they're much more antagonistic to the West and much more hardline. So they're looking at all of this. The military is building up in power, and they're saying to themselves, this is unacceptable, this is intolerable. America's getting weaker, it's bogged down in the Middle East. The point has come when we must settle with the Europeans too and show them who is really strong. There was an extraordinary statement.
Yep, that's the attitude of Russia. And the United States is bogged down in Iran. It's the deterrence of the U.S. military is at its lowest point ever right now.
By a Russian deputy foreign minister called Mikhail Ulyanov, who warned the Baltic states, stop thinking that Russia is afraid to take action against you. Now, no Russian official has spoken like that in the past. The Russians, on the contrary, have always gone out of their way to say up to now that they have no plans for military operations against the Baltic states.
Yeah, they that has been their line for the past few years up until now.
Suddenly, the rhetoric is shifting.
That's been Peskov's statement, actually, the other day was, we have no plans to take any action against Europe. This is just ridiculous talk that we're going to do anything militarily against Europe. I mean, that was pretty much what Peskov said yesterday.
But we see, and that was, and Ulyanov made that statement.
Again, that was before the UK jets flew into Ukraine and destroyed Russian drones. Another provocation. Yeah, I think it's wise to expect EU-Russia war probably within next year, possibly within the next few months.
Just after, you could see that the foreign ministry, people in the foreign ministry, the defense ministry, the Security Council, they're starting to talk differently. So again, you could start to see the tension between Putin, whose background is in the 80s.
By the way, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was the same deal. Russia signaled it was about to do something, that if these lines were crossed, it would invade Ukraine. If Ukraine kept shelling the Donbass, the Russian speakers that were in this like autonomous zone before Russia invaded, and they kept shelling. No, it was completely predictable. The invasion of Ukraine. Now we're getting close to a similarly incredibly predictable situation where Russia is going to expand the war to the rest of Europe.
And 90s, and the newer people who are coming to the fore now.
Well, you're basically describing a shift from moderates, extremely moderates under Putin, to hardliners.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. And of course, what the Europeans are doing is accelerating it. For the Europeans to talk in this way, for the Europeans to come up with these plans at a time when their own economies are buckling, when deindustrialization processes are...
Yeah, and the whole damage from the Iran war is going to hit Europe. Europe is going to be one of the places hit hardest. And you have that economic pain in the pipeline. And what are they concerned with? Doing their best to start war with Russia. That's what Europe is concerned with right now.
Are intensifying, and when the relations with the US are deteriorating, it is so
Batshit insane.
irrational that it goes beyond irrationality.
I think it makes sense.
Obviously, there is obsessiveness here. But it truly is Captain Ahab level obsessiveness.
I think it
Remember,
makes sense.
well, it makes sense in the sense.
This obsessiveness, and it's so irrational, and
Yeah.
Europe is in such a mess
Yes.
that this is the only thing they can do.
Well, yeah.
I mean, right?
well,
I mean, what
yeah,
else
I
can
mean,
they do?
Well, they can do many things. I
Well,
mean,
they
they could.
can't.
They can not provoke Russia into war. That's the other optional path. You know, UK jets can decide not to fly into Ukraine and destroy Russian drones. They can decide to do that.
But they,
change,
I mean,
but they don't want.
my
to do it.
point
That's
is,
the point, yeah.
you might as. I'm not thinking that Brussels is saying, you know what, push for war. That's
Yeah.
the way. That's the way out of this.
Well, except it's not. I mean, if we go back to that famous book about obsession, which is Moby Dick, Captain Ahab died and his ship was wrecked, but the whale survived.
Yeah, that is what we're looking at here with Europe's obsession with Russia. They're not going to get their whale.
Yeah, I understand.
I mean,
everything
that's,
you're exactly, you're exactly right. I'm
That's the
saying
trouble with this. I mean, yeah.
if you put your
Yeah, the global elites that are pushing for this war with Russia, a lot of them do have dual citizenship. They could just fly away and leave the mess behind them.
if you look at it from the Brussels globalist perspective, the way they're looking at it is, sure, they could do many things. They can start to govern. They can start to look after their people's interests. They can start to run.
I think they are in the same position as people at the U.S. Treasury, in that they've so much dirt. Like, if you're a UK politician that's covered up rapes for decades of British citizens by migrants, can you afford to let the truth come out? Can you afford to lose power? Can you afford to start governing truthfully? No, there's no option for that. If you let the system work well, let the media be independent and report on what it should, you're finished. The first thing they'll report on is your corruption.
Proper economies. They could do all these things, which they don't want to do, nor I don't even think they're capable of doing.
No,
these
that's.
things.
I
To be
think.
quite-
I
don't
think.
they have the intellectual bandwidth to
I
do
think
these things.
I think you're making a very good point. I mean, in the
But-
sense that this is all they've. It's not that it
Right.
makes sense. It's that it's all they've got. They don't have anything else. It's all they've got, and so they're sticking to it. And they're not just sticking to it; they're taking it further and further and further, even as everything else around.
Yeah, and that's why a war is inevitable, because Ukraine is losing badly on the battlefield. And as it continues to lose, it probably within a month, Russia will finally have all of Donbass, which they've been after for 4 years now. They will finally have that. And then their terms will change. And I think that any chance of negotiations, settlement between Russia and Ukraine is already dead. Now Russia is just going to take what it needs, with the security it needs. And Zelensky is finished ultimately. But as that process plays out, EU gets more desperate. They're just going to keep escalating and keep provoking Russia until Russia reacts.
And collapses. Now, it is incredibly dangerous. I mean, that's the first thing to say, and that goes back to your point. And when you're talking about rehearsing nuclear strikes on St. Petersburg, I mean, that is incredibly dangerous. I mean, that is mind-blowingly.
Yes, they're war gaming nuclear strikes on St. Petersburg in Europe. The escalation.
Fantastically, ludicrously dangerous. We may in Britain find that we can't even stop Russian merchant ships because a single Russian frigate can, humiliate the entire Royal Navy. But the point
That already happened once.
is that if you are talking to yourself and everyone else around you in this way, then that in itself creates a kind of incredibly dangerous forward momentum. And when it's the only thing you've got no restraints either, no restraints on yourself. But it is dangerous. It doesn't make it any the less irrational. It makes it more irrational.
Yeah, so that is the situation in Europe. Expect war for Europe in the very near future. Isn't that great? The war in Iran is so much fun already. War across Europe, won't that be more fun? Anyway, this will be on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kick or Twitch, and I'll see you next video. Bye.